This painting immortalizes the signing of the first Geneva Convention in 1864. At that time, in the Geneva Town Hall, the first Geneva Convention concerning the relief of military persons wounded in the field was adopted by 12 states. The only explicitly designated controlling body of the Geneva Conventions is the International Committee of the Red Cross, ICRC. The Geneva Conventions are unilaterally binding law for the signatory states. The law agreed upon there is to be applied to everyone. In the event of war, everyone is, in a sense, friend and foe. The tools have changed over the years, but the task has remained the same: to help and protect people and to ensure compliance with international humanitarian law. I'm speaking today with the president of ICRC in Geneva, Peter Maurer. War medics know no enemies. Now here on EWTN TV UN Block.
I didn't know about Ukraine at all. I had no idea, but it is something, the passion that I have for the work I do. So when I came here, I met the people, and now I can say after 1 year that yes, I just love it. I love the place. I love the people.
Unable to sleep when we started working with her. She was really extremely anxious about winter. Then she was just not functional because she always thought about what will she do, how will she work, but we really kind of mobilized her because she has a lot of resources. She always wanted to help. After speaking to the counselors over a period of 7 weeks, she feels much better. She says she sleeps better.
They are not only strong and resilient, they are also extremely kind. They are very caring.
This is an excerpt from a 2017 documentary by the International Committee of the Red Cross about the work of psychologists in Ukraine. I'm now connected with Peter Maurer from the ICRC in Geneva. Good afternoon, Peter Maurer.
Good afternoon, Christian.
The 2017 documentary is a sobering reminder that the tensions that led to the current war began many years ago, and psychological assistance was provided by the Red Cross then as it is now.
Indeed, I think two things are striking about your question, your statement, your finding. First, indeed, there is a common understanding in the press and the media today that the war started on 24th of February. This certainly contrasts with ICRC's experience. We have been on the ground since the first escalation of the war in 2014. We have scaled up our operations. We have been, in particularly on both sides of the front line, active in the Donbass. And the psychological support is just part of what ICRC has done over the last 8 years. Secondly, I wanted to highlight that you stumbled over testimony of ICRC's psychological support, and I think this is important to highlight, that starting 2014-15, and not only in Ukraine, ICRC came increasingly convinced that one of the fundamental needs in conflict would not only be the traditional physical needs of people, the water, shelter, health, nutrition, but also psychological damage done to society, to individuals, to communities, would have to be part of ICRC's humanitarian response. And indeed, Ukraine is one of those places where we have been rolling out psychosocial programs and psychosocial support programs, but also where we have been active in terms of sexual violence in the recent emanation of the conflict. Again, not only in Ukraine, but as part of a global consciousness that in today's world, psychological support is sometimes as important as physical support for humanitarian assistance.
So you have been working in Ukraine for now 8 years, and now you want to expand your activities and, quote, stay as long as we are needed. In this war, in any war, are there circumstances that could force you to withdraw for security reasons or lack of financial support?
Well, definitely ICRC is dependent on a security environment, and we are particularly dependent on security protocols and security guarantees from parties to conflict because we are working close to front lines. In Ukraine and in other contexts of the world, looking after our security is really a core part of our day-to-day work. We may from time to time decide, and our heads of delegation may decide, to temporarily suspend or to interrupt the program because of lack of security, and then security guarantee need to be negotiated. But whenever possible, we do not wish to withdraw, and certainly do not wish to withdraw for security reason just lightly. But indeed, your question is correct. When there is no willingness from parties to conflict to enter into discussions with us and to offer adequate security guarantees over time, we may be forced also at certain moments to move out of a region or to transform our program in a different way, which makes our people less sensitive to some of the security challenges. With regard to funding, here again, I don't think that we have been any time in the past in a situation where there was no funding for an important operation. But constantly we do have to set priorities. Maybe Ukraine is a little bit an example to the opposite. We have seen the enormous amount of solidarity displayed by people in Europe and beyond for Ukrainians suffering from the impact of war. And I think at the present moment, I can certainly report to you that it's one of the best financed operations around the world and one of the most generously financed operations. And in that sense, we don't think that sort of any interruption or stop of our activities in Ukraine is in the books at the present moment, neither because of the lack of willingness to engage on security, nor for the lack of funding.
For example, at the beginning of the war, Ukraine had circulated television pictures of prisoners of war. Article 14 of the Third Geneva Convention states that prisoners of war are entitled in all circumstances to respect for their persons and their honor. In addition, according to the conventions, prisoners of war must be protected from public curiosity, Article 13. We cannot and do not wish to make a legal assessment here of whether or not the publication of such images constitutes a violation of the Geneva Conventions. Peter Maurer, how does the ICRC respond to people involved in a violation of international law?
Well, it is part of our mandate not only to be working according to the principles of the Red Cross movement, in particular neutrality, impartiality and independence, but it is also our task to assist and protect people and to ensure respect for international humanitarian law. So ensuring respect for international humanitarian law, engaging in confidential dialogue with the parties, drawing their attention to failures to respect or to violations of international humanitarian law, albeit most of the time in a diplomatic, confidential way, is part of our mandate and can't be considered an infringement on impartiality, independence, or neutrality. It's part of our mandate, and I think most parties to a conflict in the present world, in so many conflicts in which we operate, do understand that it is our task also to draw the attention of political leaders and military leaders to the fact that violations happen. When we see those violations, we make recommendations to how to stop and to change the practice, of the military operations, and I think the principle is by and large well understood. What is more delicate, Christian, is discussing these issues in the public space, and indeed belligerents are very sensitive sometimes to public criticism, but it is also one of the reasons why ICRC most of the time and for the longest time possible, whenever we see violations of international humanitarian law happening or insufficient compliance with the Geneva Conventions, we would address these issues with the parties bilaterally and confidentially. And this is no infringement, neither on neutrality nor on independence.
The ICRC is a signatory to the Geneva Convention and the only recognized monitoring body of the implementation of the Geneva Conventions. Well, when we see and hear the news about wars in the 21st century, it seems that governments don't really care about the Geneva Conventions anymore. I would like to use the last words of your founder, Henry Dunant, to ask you this question. Where has humanity gone?
Well, indeed, violations of the Geneva Conventions are, for ICRC as a guardian of these conventions, a major issue of concern, and that's the reason also why, for all the 196 signatories of the conventions, we are in dialogue with those countries to promote the Geneva Conventions, to ensure knowledge about the Geneva Conventions with the militaries, with the political chains of commands. And in that sense, I would contrast your observations in the sense or differentiate. I would say, to the extent that we see negligence about the respect of international humanitarian law in military operations in so many places of the world, at the same time we also see strong commitments of governments to respect these conventions. And this speaks to the difficulties in war to respect the norms of war. So I'm not amongst those who would talk in a very generalized way of not caring about, disrespecting. It's just an illustration how difficult compliance is, but I would rather say the Geneva Conventions remain today what they have always been, the largest ratified instruments which reflects our common humanity and which needs to be implemented. And I know very few governments and I know very few military operators in today's conflict who would openly question obligations under the Geneva Conventions. What we may find is sometimes negligence, sometimes difficulties to respect, sometimes it needs the push from an organization like ICRC, but I think it remains the standard of humanity to which we need to be accountable for, and for which we do have a lot of countries already, also around the world, who are ready to engage with us, and who are committed to the respect of the conventions. Really, you can certainly say, Christian, yes, patterns of violations show that this commitment is insufficient, and here I would not disagree with you. We need more respect for the conventions and certainly no negligence about the normative framework.
You met with Pope Francis in 2014 and 2020. Are there reciprocal relationships between the Catholic Church and the ICRC?
Well, we do have many fold interactions, and my meeting with the Pope was also somehow a recognition that a lot of exchanges and cooperations do happen with the Catholic Church as with other churches and religious leaders around the world. There are obvious issues with of policy dialogue that we have with the Vatican diplomacy. I have regular contacts with Cardinal Parolin and Cardinal Gallagher, and we do discuss issues of migration, of weapons, of the rules of war, the respect for the rules of war, of ensuring principles of humanity, of facilitating and how best to facilitate contacts on the ground between the Catholic clergies and other religious leaders around the world and the ICRC. So there are multiple engagements at policy, at legal, at practical levels, and I was certainly particularly happy to have this multiplicity of dialogue with the Catholic Church and with many other religious leaders around the world being somehow confirmed by the 2 meetings during my 10 years of stay at the ICRC I had with the Pope. Looking at the costs of conflict, I always think most of the war that I have observed, most of the wars and conflict, shouldn't even have started.
Conflict and war leave people with physical and psychological damage that sometimes never heals. No band-aids from the Red Cross will help in their case. During his meeting with members of the volunteer organization Ho Avuto Sete, I was thirsty, at the Vatican in March, Pope Francis said, "This is a serious matter. We must create awareness that continued spending on weapons corrupts the soul, the heart and humanity." And the Pope went on to say, "What good is it if we all engage together solemnly at the international level in campaigns against poverty, against hunger, against the destruction of the planet, if we then fall back into the old vice of war, into the old strategy of the power of armaments, which sets back everything and everyone?" Thank you so much for watching. God bless.